Okay, everybody, back on the mic here to talk about the Steve Jobs movie that was released this winter and why, at least I think, it was a financial flop. I actually saw the movie myself and read the first half of the book, the self-commissioned book, right up until the point where Apple takes off, which I suppose was the end of my interest. Now, in talking about this, we are going to be a little naughty here because we're using hindsight. It's very easy, of course, to seem smart when nothing we say can be proven wrong and fits all the observations. But in a little bit of fairness, I did say, I think on Twitter before the movie was released, that I didn't see how you could make a good movie about Steve Jobs. So at least from that perspective, partly I was seeing things pretty well. However, the reason why I wouldn't simply declare that the movie would be no good or would make no money is that, for one, you don't know how writers and filmmakers are going to handle the stories in the first place. There's a lot of artistic license possible. You could call the movie Steve Jobs and have the movie focus on another character or be told from the perspective of another character, similar to the way Antonio Salieri was the main character in Amadeus, or The Silence of the Lambs was marketed around Hannibal Lecter but was mostly about Clarice Starling, and so on. That's a well-known device, and that would change the entire perspective of the movie and make it potentially great, I suppose. Likewise, details of the story could be altered or changed or reflect things that people don't know. Like I said, I'm familiar with the history of Apple up to the company becoming a multi-million-dollar business. Then after that, I don't really know. There's a lot of details in people's lives, some of which lend themselves more to journalistic coverage and may be negative, while other things might be more positive and not be covered as much, but come in very handy to provide dimension or redeeming qualities to someone for the movie. So that could have happened too. Those things could have come into play. Similarly, there's also the notion of me not being able to predict all the ways that other people might respond to someone. In my understanding, Steve Jobs was a huge figure among Apple fans, and there's a lot of Apple fans, so if the movie caught on with them, it could gross a large amount of money, similar to the way the iPhone or something else like it grosses a large amount of money, so that could happen too. So you can't just come out and declare that such and such source material is fatally flawed and the movie won't work or won't gross money. However, I did question the specific subject matter here and how well it could translate to a movie for quite specific reasons, which seemed to translate directly into the film and really hampered its potential, which we can talk about now. Okay, for one, as we've discussed, movies exist to provide good feelings to the audience. People show up very often in movies because we naturally have instincts to pay attention to people and react to things that other people do. So while they're not entirely necessary, they come in very handy. But when people are used, in order for them to play a part in the audience liking the movie, the people have to have certain traits. In a basic sense, if you're going to make a movie about a person, you're going to have to use that person almost always to provide what I like to call confirmation to the audience. Generally, this means that the person is going to be someone who the audience wants to succeed, wonders whether or not they will succeed, and then is happy when the person does. So you have a problem right off the bat if you're going to make a movie with Steve Jobs as the main character, because Steve Jobs' public image was of somebody who was an absolute jerk to people. You know, callous, self-centered, unrealistic, arrogant, and so on. If you make a movie about someone like that, the audience is not going to enjoy that person's success. It might look like a movie, you'll have a main character and there'll be people talking and a plot line and so on, but you end up not doing what a movie does if you portray a jerk conquering the world. Now, you can, of course, have a jerk for a main character. There's even been movies called literally The Jerk. But if you're going to do that, you almost certainly have to have the jerk lose in the end. The pleasure we get is in having our values, our beliefs about the world confirmed or underlined by what we see in the movie. If it goes against that, it actually feels bad for the audience. It's not pleasurable. So beyond just not delivering, you're actively doing the opposite of what people want. If you watched the movie, you'll know, minor spoilers here, you'll know that they did make a nod to the reality of needing to redeem their character in the end, since they essentially had a story about a jerk winning and making a ton of money. But they did it by having him simply change his mind and claim his daughter. You know, throughout the movie he refuses to really accept her as his biological daughter. Then in the end he does. But honestly, that's just not enough. A jerk wins big, then changes his mind about one thing while still winning, is not the formula for something that's going to have audiences cheering. You're still essentially telling a story that does the opposite of what a movie is supposed to do. And as you can imagine, for an emotion-based product, giving the opposite of good emotions will create lots of problems. But having said that, of course, there are other things that a main character does in a story which contribute to the experience, even if their personal traits and their fate mess up the movie overall. Which is a major reason why I think the movie was greenlit in the first place. And greenlit multiple times by more than one company, since there was, of course, an Ashton Kutcher version, which we are pretending doesn't exist, and this much bigger budget version. In this case, your character should have the ability to create interest in the audience, some desire to pay attention to that person. And if someone is really well known, then we'll have some natural desire to know more about that person. How did they get their money or their fame? Is there some specific aspect to their character or personality that caused it that we can make use of to help ourselves in our own lives, and so on. If you go to the magazine rack at the supermarket, you'll see the entire industry that's fed by this natural urge, and of course Steve Jobs had that, which made it very feasible that a movie about him would draw interest and he would work as an interesting character. But this is where things kind of came back to bite the filmmakers in the butt, I think. Because, as I said, the Apple fans were the ones who could make the movie a hit despite any potentially less functional storyline. But the Apple fans, from what I've seen, actually protested the movie and thought it was too negative in how it showed Steve Jobs. So they ended up boycotting the movie. So the strongest card that the film had going for it ended up not coming into play, and even working against it, which I think probably was one of the major problems. Because once you get outside of Apple fans, you have a fundamental question that you have to ask yourself about any movie when it comes time to determine how much money it's going to make. And that is, who is going to want to see it? In other words, what's the target demographic, as marketing people say? And the problem is that this movie really doesn't have one. The oldest audience members aren't particularly interested in new technology, let alone the people making it. There isn't anything particularly attractive to the 18 to 34-year-old male demographic, unless again you count tech heads, and a large number of them are already boycotting. If you look at women's issues, there's really nothing here, and in fact, Steve Jobs spends most of the movie being neglectful to his daughter and nasty to her mother. There's no romance, there's no empowerment, just not much at all, really nothing that might draw in people with those interests. Teenagers, both boys and girls, may like electronics and games, but you're not really focusing on the electronics and the games. You're focusing on corporate politics. How is that going to draw them in? Furthermore, you're talking about the corporate politics behind inventions that came out decades ago. The movie shows the launch of the Macintosh in 1984, the Next Cube around 1988, and the iMac around 1998. Most of today's teenagers weren't even born when those were out, let alone being old enough to have any memories. So you automatically have lost relevance with them. It doesn't deal with or provide any new information about anything that's on their minds. Furthermore, the ultra death blow is that the movie has nothing whatsoever to appeal to young children. Young children are generally the most profitable demographic to hit in terms of box office, because they have to be brought by their parents. So you generally sell 2 tickets for every child you attract to a movie. And this is beyond them buying merchandise or being the ones most likely to want to see something new, which they are. And of course, you're talking about very mature things in this movie. People arguing about paternity and no action. Nothing starkly moral enough for children to benefit from either. Just really absolutely nothing. And that's a major problem. And on top of that, for pretty similar reasons, you also show up with very little to attract international audiences, particularly because the movie is almost entirely centered on dialogue. International audiences generally don't speak English, so they respond the best to things that are visual, explosions, actions, and so on. Things that are specifically language-based or deal with individual cultural issues in America do very little for them. They don't pick up on the subtleties of our language, which are key to enjoying those movies. So there's just not much there that they're going to want to see. So when you mix those various issues together, you have the formula for a potential dud in terms of who is going to be attracted to the film in the first place. Just that small fraction of potential viewers kind of kills your top end in terms of what you can do, which is why studios like to aim as broadly as they can. So even if the movie doesn't work and you only bring in a fraction of your potential audience, that's still the highest number you can get. and you have the most margin for error. Here, they didn't give themselves that. So a flaw in the actual execution of the story gets hugely magnified since you already have limited audience appeal. And the loss of Apple fans was probably, demographic-wise, a kiss of death. The movie would have to have been technically fantastic to draw in multiple viewings and some word of mouth. They just could not afford for that not to happen. And it didn't. Now, like we talked about, they did have the lack of a hero character. But there were some other things too that really became major problems with the small target space that they gave themselves. And I'll give you one example, which I'm a little bit not happy to say. Every now and then when someone writes something, they fall into the temptation to, rather than give the audience a good time, to try to subtly signal something about themselves to the audience. This is where you get a lot of pretentiousness, people trying to seem smart instead of give the audience a good time. I personally think that trying to sound smart is a great way to not sound smart to people that are smart. And if you just execute well or have something useful to say, then you'll come off well. But you can still fall to that temptation, and I could sense that happening in the writing of the movie. And usually I think that if I can sense it, everyone else can too. And there's little moments of becoming too fascinated with smart sounding things. Like, for example, there's one particular scene where they're discussing how Steve Jobs claimed that 28% of the men in America could be Lisa's father. And she says to him, there's a team of statisticians trying to reverse engineer the formula you use to come up with that number. And it's like, really? What is the point of that line except to take a sort of joy in the image of cleverness? I don't know. It can often be hard to put instinctive reactions into words, but it's a little bit off. It's almost like there's too much pleasure being taken in people saying things like that. The audience is not a group of people paying to watch you try to convince them of your own greatness or talk over their heads. I don't know, I'm probably not putting it across too well. But if you watch the Kaufman's Folly video, I dissected a scene that was written by the same screenwriter, and I went through what I found to be elements of the scene that served to damage the audience's self-image. This movie's not identical to that. I wouldn't necessarily say it falls victim to Kaufman's Folly, since there are flawed people throughout the movie. But the idea of giving the impression of wallowing in the superiority of yourself or your characters comes across the same way. It might make you feel good as the writer or filmmaker, but it's the wrong good feeling to chase. I think it's dangerous. Having said that, the movie does also take a unique approach, which I thought was interesting to see, which is that it doesn't have any traditional form of beginning, middle, and end. At least not the way it's normally done. In normal study of writing, they call it the first act, second act, and third act. But those terms don't carry any real information about why they're used or what they do. So I try to avoid terms like that. The movie simply has a series of conversations between characters backstage at different product launches, in logarithmic time, which I did describe with hopefully some real information in the last video. But in this particular case, I actually think that the technique used, while innovative, really actually watered down the movie. It weakened it. And that's because in getting rid of the normal beginning, where you introduce the characters, show the situation occurring, and start at a low level of tension and emotion and build up, they lost all those things that beginning of a movie actually does. For example, the movie starts in the middle of an argument about whether or not the Mac will be able to say hi during the product launch, with of course only quote-unquote 5 minutes until it launches. This is what I view as a sort of trap for writers, if I can describe it for a second. Because you have certain things that you can feel will be interesting to the audience, like having tension in your scene, people arguing, time running out, and things like that. And you can get worried when that's not there. So you inject it into the opening of your movie. But in the process of doing it, you don't realize that openings don't have that stuff for a reason. Openings are different. They create interest their own way. And when you go past that, you lose the emotional connection that you create at the beginning, for example, when you start at a low level of emotion. It's like trying to ballroom dance with someone by snatching them by the hand and spinning them around before they can even get out of their chair. Movies meet you at the level of emotion you have when you come in from the real world. Just like a dance partner, a good dance partner, takes you by the hand and leads you onto the floor. And as the tension ratchets up, you then go with it, step by step, smoothly. You don't start at a high level of tension because it's too jarring for the audience. You leave yourself nowhere to go if you do that. And you can actually exhaust the audience too early. That's why roller coaster rides only last 3 or 4 minutes. Your heart rate and energy level can only peak for so long before you want to stop. So in giving away that beginning, the movie lost something as a story. And that of course had a ripple effect, because you couldn't build the tension in order to continually create new interest. It was just one note: argue, argue, argue. People couldn't really get more angry. They couldn't get less time, because you already started at the peak level of anger and the least amount of time. So it was all the same, and it became monotonous. And on top of that, you have another issue, in that you actually lost almost the whole idea of the biopic, which is getting to follow the journey of someone else's life. You know, I'm interested in Steve Jobs' life. Even if I think he's a jerk, I still have curiosity about what it was like to go from a garage, building a company in a garage, to a multi-billion-dollar business. Heck, I read that part of the book. That journey, getting to live or see someone else's existence, is really the unique appeal of a biopic. There isn't really anything else that can do that. And here, we don't get that. You get only the slightest nod, a flashback for 1 or 2 lines of them sitting in the garage. And that's actually important. That feeling of seeing a life change from young to old, from one level to another, is emotionally powerful. It's one of the things that really make us feel like we followed a story. Just like the satisfaction of curiosity about someone's life. It's one of the most powerful experiences we can have. So when you start with them already at the point where the company is successful, you lose all of that. And really, the most life change for Steve Jobs is when the company goes from the garage to the high-rise buildings. That's also the point where his life goes from normal to abnormal in a lot of ways. So a lot of your curiosity, if you want to imagine what that would be like in your own life, is focused on that part of his experience. You know, it's the classic rags to riches. It hits that deep within us. Like I said, I read that part of the book, then actually lost interest when it got to the part where the movie actually begins. So it seems like the movie had a slight gain in that it did things differently from most other movies, but it lost too much because it didn't accomplish the things that that more traditional form of storytelling does. You can escape from those things, it's good to be original, but you have to keep in mind that those things do certain things for an audience. And you have to either fulfill those things in different ways, or provide some things that are different or new, that are powerful enough emotionally to outweigh what you lost. Which might explain why it's difficult to make things that are both different and better. Not that it can't be done. Now, even if you take that correct approach, we should still look at the actual focus of the movie, because it is on Steve Jobs, and to be honest, they might have done better to make the movie actually about Steve Wozniak, with Steve Jobs as an offshoot character, like the other movies we mentioned. Really, Jobs and Wozniak are the key figures in the development of Apple. They're the guys who were there from the beginning, who are both very smart, and who both have unique personalities. So if you're going to make that movie, those guys have to be the focus in one way or another. And as we said, Jobs lacks certain heroic qualities, whereas Wozniak was actually a pretty nice guy. A very nice guy, in fact, who also was in all likelihood a real genius. I think that despite the amount of promotion that was done, there were certain elements missing from Steve Jobs' life story that are the type of thing we look for in these kinds of movies, which an increased focus on Wozniak might have provided. Particularly, mainly, there's the fact that Steve Jobs didn't really play any indispensable role in the computer revolution. He was there for it. He was one of the guys who was involved with a company that exploded as part of that time, but he wasn't a causal factor there, which is a major issue. Our instincts are not going to be triggered by the guy next to the guy who started the revolution. We're going to want to move that guy out of the way so we can get a better look at the guy who we see actually making the difference. And to be honest, if you're looking for that character, you really should be focusing on Steve Wozniak. You know, this is brought up in the movie. For the first half decade or more of Apple's existence, the Apple II was the overwhelming majority of their profits, and Steve Wozniak built the Apple II in his garage. That classic story we like, about the guy coming from nowhere to influence things, being self-reliant, having great talent, all of it. You would get that from focusing on Wozniak. And if you're really interested in how someone could do something so different and revolutionary, like building the best computer product in history by themselves in their garage, using spare parts, listen to what Wozniak says about it. He has a few talks here on YouTube. They're just him behind a podium speaking to students, but he talks entirely about how he studied everything himself, took apart any new computer product that came out so he could see how it worked, and how he relied on his own mind. It's great stuff. Now, I do think based on the book and what we can see, both guys were important to what happened. Wozniak, however, only wanted to design computers. He didn't care about the marketing. And his story is one of the things that influenced me to start sharing my own ideas, since you have to present what you have to other people. And Steve Jobs saw that too. But I think you would have to make a movie about both of them and not just marginalize Wozniak, which they did in the Steve Jobs movie. You really need the role he played in a more significant form. And his humble and likable personality, you need much more. Jobs just isn't likable enough. But also, I think with Wozniak's story, you don't really have an ending. And unfortunately, Steve Jobs has passed away, and that would provide a button on the great success that both of them achieved. And if you do it well and provide that rags to riches story, make it believable, follow their lives, maybe soften Jobs a bit, show some of the better sides of his personality, you'd have something that really could be fantastic. As is, I think it was okay, but just missed in too many ways. And just to point this out, very often we'll look at one cause, like the lack of demographic appeal, and just chalk that up to the whole issue. But then we get confused if we see something else with that supposed problem, like The Social Network, which was very successful in awards and reception, and we won't be able to draw a conclusion anymore. However, The Social Network used a more traditional story structure with the beginning-to-end experience of Facebook taking off, and it involved younger people and a more relevant company to younger viewers, among other things. So, The Social Network clearly succeeded for other reasons, even though it had that one problem. So instead, we have to look at all the factors together and how they layer, and take them into account as a whole. And by that measure, I think we can see clearly that there were just far too many things working against the Steve Jobs movie, and not enough working for them. I hope you enjoyed listening to this. I'm really excited about this year, by the way, and I'm also a bit nervous about what we're going to be doing on this channel because we're moving up in scale, and we're moving up with the ideas we're going to be talking about. But it's time for me to get to work on that stuff. So thanks for listening, and stay subscribed.